Bom dia, and welcome back to beautiful Salvador Bahia, Brazil, where I am currently living and plan to live for quite a long time, perhaps forever. And today I wanted to talk about why I've always been attracted to and wanted to live abroad outside of my home country. I think as a prelude to the logistics of moving abroad. What has motivated me to leave my home country and live in a different culture and learn and live in a different language? I hope you can all see me. I was born in Oz, the Emerald City. In other words, I was born in a place that was in many ways unusual, not a typical hometown for a child of my generation. That would be the boomer generation, 1950s and 1960s. I was born and spent my early childhood in Manhattan, in New York City. And I think I got Manhattan and all of its frenetic energy in my nervous system. And that has been one element that has made me more adaptable to living in, how should I say, unusual or foreign environments. And another reason that I've always been attracted to, drawn to, and felt comfortable in foreign environments is that growing up in childhood and adolescence, I always felt a bit foreign to my reality, or I should say the reality around me. I knew that I was gay at a very young age. At the dawn of consciousness, maybe late 3, 4, I always knew I was gay. And of course, for any child, that can be difficult or alienating, or at least will put a child in a different psychological space than a child who is not aware of those kind of feelings. It was magnified by the fact that I was a child in the 1950s and 60s when gay rights, gay consciousness, gayness in itself was criminalized, not spoken of. It was pathologized. So that heavily contributed to me always feeling like an outsider, of not fitting in, feeling like a bit of an oddball. Something that I appreciate now, but as a child, it was difficult, especially in social settings and school settings where we spend so much of our time. And I think that's why, from a very early age, I was attracted to and interested in and drawn to foreign cultures and foreign languages. If I was going to be a stranger in my own land and an oddity in the world that I lived in, then somehow intuitively, long before I started traveling abroad, I knew that I would find comfort and fellowship outside of my home environment, and that being in a foreign land would make being different more natural. So I grew up always longing to travel abroad, to speak another language, to travel. We didn't. My family was, I suppose it was through most of my all of my childhood and early adolescence, it was, I would have to say, upper middle class. Things changed when I was 15. But up until then, we lived well. We did travel, but domestically, typically from the Northeast United States, New York and Pennsylvania. We would travel down to Florida to visit my grandparents, or to the West Coast to California to visit my biological father, but not the kind of travel I really wanted to do, which is foreign travel. And I was not exposed to foreign languages. Again, this is the 50s and the 60s. So I was only able to finally sate my desire to travel when I was 19. And then I did it with a vengeance. While going to college, I also worked. I moved to San Francisco when I was 20. And I went to a state university. And at the same time, I worked as a waiter. And if you know San Francisco, it's got a lot of tourists. It's a fairly wealthy town, and it's very progressive. Anyway, San Franciscans and out-of-town tourists are good tippers. So, at an age when early 20s college people are often broke, I often had a lot of money coming in the form of tips, basically. This was the very early 70s, and I could come home with $100 in cash in my pocket, which at that time was a lot of money. And what I would do, I had a pattern. I'd go to college for a semester and work my ass off, going to school full-time and working almost full-time. I'd save every penny, and then I would take a semester off, typically 6 months, and I would get on a plane and I would travel. Long trips to Europe. Those were the days when you could get a 3-month Eurail pass. They don't exist anymore, but I'd get a couple of Eurail passes and wander around Europe, or I'd take the long, what was called, I think it was called the hippie trail in those days in the 70s, where you'd make the pilgrimage from Western Europe across Turkey and Iran and Afghanistan, Pakistan, all the way to India, and then travel around India. Epic trip. That really, really got me addicted to foreign travel and traveling and living abroad. And so those are my early 20s, mid-20s. And then, around, I guess it was around 26, 27, a little voice inside of me started saying, hey, you gotta start being a responsible adult now. You can't be a waiter forever. So I remember one day I walked off the job, my waiter job. It was at the Hippo restaurant in San Francisco. And I never looked back. And started working office jobs, more professional type jobs, more adult type jobs. What I thought were jobs that were leading to adulthood. Anyway, the 80s, with a couple of exceptions, I did run off to India one more time in the 80s, But I settled down, worked at all places, the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco. My God, if that's not a traditional white collar, uptight kind of job, I don't know what is. And I was an analyst of all things. Me, who failed algebra every time I'd try to take it, never completed never passed algebra in high school or junior high. I was working as an analyst at the Federal Reserve Bank. It was a testament to my native intelligence, because I certainly was not qualified on paper or any other way. And lasted there for 3 whole years. I remember, wow, 3 years at the same job. Quit, and I did run off to India after that job, and that was the mid-'80s. And then I came back, and I became very politically aware. Became very active. I was what was called an outside agitator at UC Berkeley in the anti-apartheid movement, and then in the anti-U.S. intervention in Central America movement in San Francisco. Got arrested at demonstrations a couple times. 2 badges of honor in my worldview. Both times those charges were dropped, so I never got a record, which turned out to be a good thing later in years when I was applying for visas and recently for permanent residency here in Brazil. I have a clean FBI record. So anyway, after being a political outside agitator, I realized I finally needed to get a job. I was broke, and I found my dream job in a large social service agency, in a social service program serving low-income and homeless families in San Francisco's Tenderloin neighborhood, which is kind of the Skid Row of San Francisco. And I thought I had died and gone to heaven. And it fit me like a glove. I loved it. I felt fulfilled. I felt like I was contributing something. Like I never felt like at a job at the Federal Reserve, where I was just crunching numbers and had no idea really what the purpose of what I was doing was. It was probably contributing to how people analyze the health and the state of the U.S. economy, but I didn't give a damn about that. But I did give a damn about what I was doing as director of a social service program in San Francisco's Tenderloin. And I did that for 8 years, which for me was like a lifetime. And towards the end of my time there at the social service agency, our population, our client population, had sifted from largely Southeast Asian, Vietnamese, Chinese, Cambodian, to more and more Hispanic, Spanish-speaking. I said to myself, Michael, I really need to learn Spanish. I knew I wasn't going to teach myself Vietnamese, but it was too difficult. But Spanish, I felt like, and I'd always, and besides my travel bugs in childhood, I'd always felt a strong need to speak a second language. I always felt like my education was sorely lacking. I felt almost inadequate, because I remember on trips for Europe, for example, I'll never forget, I sat in a train. It was traveling through Switzerland, and there was an elderly woman in my compartment. These were the days when trains in Europe had compartments, and she wanted to strike up a conversation, and she spoke to me in French, and I shook my head no. German, no. Italian, no. Spanish, no. And the only language that she didn't speak was English, and I only spoke English. I remember her looking at me with pity. Although she didn't say anything derogative, I could very much sense it in her the way she looked at me. Anyway, that was a moment when I said, wow, I am as however culturally superior and sophisticated I thought I was. I realized I was just American country bumpkin who only spoke English. And so that experience really planted the seed that I needed to become bilingual. And later at that job, that social service agency where I was a director, by the way, I finally said, I have to teach myself to speak Spanish. And so every day, 3 times a day, I would dedicate 20, 30 minutes a day to teach yourself. I bought myself at a used bookstore a teach yourself Spanish book. Never took a class, never had a teacher, but it was the book that went from the very basic through every single verb tense. Present, past, future, conditional, and all the tenses in between. And I would do every single exercise in the book until I got to the end. And when I finished it, it wasn't even that thick of a book. I was a Spanish speaker. Well, I knew Spanish grammar, and I had a fairly decent vocabulary, but I still really couldn't speak. So the next step was, I lived in California, which has a huge Spanish-speaking population, if you don't know. And I would go out, and I happened to live in the Latino neighborhood, the Mission District, so I would go out and find opportunities. I would, go to my neighborhood bar, a Latino gay bar, and hang out there and meet people and speak in Spanish at stores, at restaurants. I remember once someone I knew who was very much into Latino culture, but typical American, didn't speak Spanish. And I asked him, and he was moving to Mexico, of all things. I said, you need to learn to speak Spanish. And he says, well, maybe I can do that when I get to Mexico, but, I can't do it here. And I didn't say anything, but I thought to myself, wow, you live in California. And he previously had lived in Texas. After, there were how many Spanish-speaking countries in the world? Something like 23. Of all of those countries, after Mexico, the United States is the second largest Spanish-speaking country in the world. So nobody can tell me there's no opportunities to practice Spanish in the United States, especially in a state like California. So anyway, I became very conversational, very good at Spanish within a year. And by the time I left that job, when I would speak on the telephone with someone in Spanish, they would often mistake me for a native speaker, which would surprise me and flatter me. Of course, when they saw me, I don't look anything like a Latino, but my Spanish was pretty damn good. And anyway, and at work, this is what gave me a kick in the pants. At work, two co-workers up and moved to Mexico. And I thought, my God, why? That's my dream, is to move abroad. And I speak Spanish now. And here they are moving, and they were both women, brave, independent, well-educated women. I thought, if they're doing it, why don't I? So I turned in my notice, and I moved to Mexico City. This is in early 90s. Now Mexico City is high up there on the global nomad places to be. There are even demonstrations now in Mexico City about how gringos are taking over certain neighborhoods. But that was not the case in the early 1990s. I was somewhat of a pioneer. And on the third day, I got a job as an English teacher. I was in heaven. I was walking on air. And Mexico City at that time was it still is big, giant city, but it was heavily crime-ridden. The air was thick. You could taste that the air pollution was so bad. There was a lot of corruption. I was robbed by the police 3 times. One time they came to the school where I had worked myself up from teacher to director. They came to the federales, the federal police, came to my school, pulled out their guns, forced them all everybody into my office, teachers and students alike, robbed us, robbed the school, carried out the computers, forced the guys, including myself, to take our pants off and stand around in our underwear so we wouldn't run around the street after them. Not a pleasant experience. I still love Mexico City, but at that time I said, it's time for a change. So I stayed in Mexico, but I moved to the state of Veracruz, where I got a job at the National Oil Company teaching English, Pemex. Anyway, I love Mexico. I will always love Mexico. Mwah! Thank you, Mexico. But by that time, my curiosity about the rest of the Spanish-speaking world had been piqued, and so I slowly started moving my way down. I did return to the United States, but started traveling frequently to other parts of Latin America, starting in, I remember Guatemala was next, and then I got to all of the Central American countries except Costa Rica, and then working my way down South America until I finally had visited almost all of the countries and got my way down to Argentina. And then, one day when I was back in San Francisco, I was walking down the street, Castro Street, and I'm normally an introverted shy guy. I met on the street, highly unusual for me, a guy from Brazil. I don't know how this happened. It was serendipity. It was fate. We began talking. He was a nice guy, my age, professional, and he was staying, in a kind of hostel. San Francisco, very expensive city, so he was staying in a hostel, and I said, that's silly. Come stay. I lived in a classic big multi-room Victorian, San Francisco, 19th century Victorian at the time. So, come stay with me. I've got plenty of space. And so he did. He moved out of the hostel and came and stayed with me and stayed a week. I saved him some money. He definitely piqued my interest in Brazil. And I said, I'm going to come down and visit you because I've been all over Latin America, but I've never been to Brazil. He said, okay. So he went home. And a few months later, I remember it was November 1999, I made my first, I think it was 2-week visit to Brazil. Like a month prior to that, I was a very fluent Spanish speaker at this point. I said, well, Portuguese. I had absolutely no exposure to Portuguese. I didn't even know what it sounded like. I said, but it's going to be easy. They're like linguistic cousins. So I bought myself a 10 class package of one-on-one Portuguese lessons at Berlitz. It was very expensive. I didn't need to do that, but anyway, I quickly learned in those 10 lessons that Portuguese was not just an easy version of Spanish. It is on paper. I could read it pretty well from the very beginning, but I couldn't understand a word what the teacher was saying. And so anyway, I went to Brazil with a tiny bit of Portuguese under my belt and stayed with my friend. His name was Marco. He lived in Sao Paulo, a big, giant megacity, the New York City of South America. And it's certainly not a beautiful city, but it's an extremely dynamic city. I told you I had Manhattan in my blood, and so I adapt and like big, giant, throbbing, chaotic cities like Sao Paulo, like Mexico City, where I also live. And so, also went to Rio, made a side trip to Rio, and liked it. And came home and I said, okay, I need to add a second language. I'm fluent in Spanish. Now let's make Portuguese my second language. And so, the same way I taught myself to speak Spanish with teach-yourself books, I taught myself Portuguese. Now, Spanish is easy to learn from self-help books. But Portuguese, you need more than just a self-help book. You can learn the grammar and vocabulary from a self-help book, but to hear, understand spoken Portuguese and to produce spoken Portuguese, you need other resources. Fortunately, by this time, it was the early 2000s, and there were a lot more resources available. The internet, for example. Later, YouTube, a huge help. And so, using all the resources at my disposal, I started to become more and more proficient conversational in Portuguese. And I moved back to Sao Paulo. This time, as a foreigner, you're allowed to stay in Brazil for up to 6 months. 3 months you get when you arrive, then you can get it extended for another 3 months. So I went down, and I moved in with my friend Marco in Sao Paulo. And I believe for the next 2 years, I lived in Sao Paulo half the year. I became more and more proficient in Portuguese. I became more and more integrated with Brazilians and fell more and more in love with Brazil. And I still hadn't, other than Rio, which I also loved, I really hadn't seen, what one imagines Brazil to be. The tropical paradise, the beaches, the Amazon, the flora and fauna, etc. And then at the beginning of the 3rd year, Marco and I had a falling out. We were very different people. He was a good person, but, we had a falling out, and I left his apartment, went to the airport, classic Michael, got on a plane, and flew up here to Salvador. Everybody prior to that, they always say you have to know Salvador. You have to see Salvador if you really want to know Brazil. It was Brazil's first capital. It's where Brazil was founded. It's a unique culture. The music, the Afro-Brazilian influence has to be seen if you really want to understand Brazil. Okay, I hope my finger always ends up in the video. Hopefully it didn't this time. Anyway, so I came to Salvador, and then something really clicked. And to make a long story short, that was in 2003, I believe. Here I am, over 20 years later. It's 2024 now. Here I am. I'm a permanent resident of Brazil. Kind of like I have what would be equivalent in the United States of a green card. It's valid for the rest of my life. I never have to leave if I don't want to, and I really don't, except for short trips back up to the United States or to Europe, for example. And I am now qualified to apply for Brazilian citizenship, and I'm going to do that this year. I have to take a Portuguese course. It's required, even though I speak fluent Portuguese now. I'm going to take the damn course, pass the test. So I'm going to take the course and pass it, and then I'll be eligible to apply, and I'm going to do it. I want that Brazilian passport in my hand, and of course I'll be a dual citizen, so I'll have 2 passports, and live happily ever after. So I just wanted to give you an idea of my origin story, how I became a world citizen, a global traveler, how I ended up here in Brazil, why I love living abroad, and I hope that you who are watching have or find your place on this planet. It doesn't have to be in Brazil, obviously, and it doesn't even have to be abroad, but I hope that you find the place where you're happy and that it's a good fit for you, as Salvador, Brazil has become for me. So anyway, I want to wish you all a good week or weekend that's coming up, and I'll see you in the next episode. Thanks for joining me. Beijo. Ciao.